This is the Energizing India podcast.
On this podcast, we engage with the key thinkers and leaders shaping India's economic, energy and policy landscape. I'm your host, Ravin MIRCHANDANI, and today, honestly, I'm a little bit starstruck. Joining us on the show is someone we have admired for years and who really needs no introduction at all to a business audience, as he was one of the true architects of the modern India which we inhabit today, a journey which the country commenced in 1991. Montec Singh AHLUWALIA is an economist, a policy visionary, and was a civil servant who, along with the then Finance Minister Manmohan Singh, played a pivotal role in steering India through the 1991 economic crisis, a moment of near default when the country had to pledge its gold to keep the economy afloat. He later served as the Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission from 2004 to 2014, holding the rank of Cabinet Minister, and before that was the first Director of the Independent Evaluation Office of the IMF. Today, we go behind the scenes of the 1991 crisis, what really happened in those tense days, the battles that were fought in the corridors of power, and how India chose the path of liberalisation. We also look ahead to the turbulence of the present moment: global trade wars, tariff barriers, and a new era of supply chain geopolitics. What does all of this mean for India, and how do we chart a path forward? This is a rare and candid conversation with a man who has seen it all, from Washington to New Delhi, and helped shape India's economic destiny. Montec Singh AHLUWALIA, welcome to the program.
Well, thank you for having me.
Montec, I want to start with a quote from Manmohan Singh that you very often say in public audiences. Everything that they say about India is true, but the opposite is true as well. And my first question really would like to take you back to 1991. You were at the heart of India's economic policy making during one of our darkest hours. Can you take us back to that era and talk about the emotional and political mood in the corridors of power when India had to ship its gold just to stay afloat?
Well, that was an exceptional time in which extensive controls over the private sector, different activities, in particular over the ability to import what you wanted, was kind of keeping the economy going at a certain level. And what happened in 1991 is really the consequence of a huge foreign exchange crisis which hit us in 1990. I mean, when Saddam Hussein moved into Kuwait and the oil price shot up, at that time, the domestic political environment in India was highly uncertain. You had VP Singh as the Prime Minister, had just introduced the Mandal reservations, agitations against him. The government was politically unstable. And, foreign investors thought that India will never be able to manage the huge burden of foreign exchange caused by the oil price hike, given its political instability. And money that used to come in to finance the deficit stopped coming in. And indeed, that money that matured started going out. And very soon, the foreign exchange reserves went down. Now, in a system where the exchange rate is flexible, when money starts going out, the exchange rate depreciates. And as the exchange rate depreciates, there's an automatic correction in the sense that those who export have an incentive to bring money back and to export more, and those who import have an incentive not to. When you have a fixed exchange rate and a perception that you're going to have a scarcity, exactly the opposite happens. People who are earning money sort of keep it abroad because they don't know whether the exchange rate is going to collapse or not. And those who have to import much more than they need because they don't know whether they're going to be able to do this. And this cumulative impact accelerated the pace at which reserves went down. And, VP Singh's government fell in November, I think, of 1990. Chandrasekhar took over with an even weaker government backed by the Congress party from outside. It was quite clear that he was not going to be able to manage. You needed to take some tough steps. You also needed to get some money from somewhere to tide over the period. And at that time, before collapsing, VP Singh asked me, he said, Montek, do you think we can avoid going to the IMF? Because going to the IMF in those days was regarded as a sign, which it was a sign of mismanagement.
A failure.
You should have managed the economy by taking corrective steps earlier. And by the way, he had been warned. I mean, the day he came in, we told him that, look, the situation is a little fluid and you need to take some corrective steps. But he had political preoccupations, etc. So the critical thing was that the reserves were running down to near zero level. I think we had at one stage reserves for only about a few weeks of imports as opposed to 3 to 4 months, which would have been normal. And when that happens, the release of foreign exchange was unnecessarily delayed. I was Commerce Secretary at the time, and I recall speaking to the Finance Secretary that, listen, exporters who have a permission to import duty-free, things they need in order to export, are being denied $10 million to import what they want, which would generate about $40 million within 6 months. And he told me that, look, the problem is the Reserve Bank of India has said that all releases above X amount have to be cleared by the Reserve Bank, even though they have the import permission. So the import license was actually ineffective. There was another overlay of controls. So I think it was very clear that the system was in crisis. Some corrective steps were needed. And VP Singh said, can I avoid going to the IMF? I said, yes, you can avoid going to the IMF if you're willing to take even more difficult steps than the IMF would want. If you want to make a virtue of not going to the IMF, you should say that, look, in order to get money, they will want some corrective steps. Those corrective steps will give me breathing time of 2 years, during which they will take effect. And in that period, they'll give me finance. But I don't want to go to the IMF. Therefore, we have to take even stronger steps so that the correction takes place earlier. He didn't decide one way or the other, but that was the situation. By the time his government fell and Chandrasekhar's government also fell, it was quite clear that we had to go to the IMF. And that's when the Reserve Bank wanted to borrow against the gold they had, with an understanding that they'd be able to buy back, in effect sell the gold with a buyback provision. And the interesting thing was that the Bank of England could have done that, leaving the gold in Bombay. But they said, no, we can only lend against gold if the gold is in our vaults. So we had to ship this amount of gold abroad in order to get the Reserve Bank, Bank of England, to give you the money value before you buy it back. So there was a clear sense that the thing has broken down. There's a crisis. Inflation was high. Every industrialist, every exporter knew that the system wasn't working. And that's the situation in which the reforms got introduced.
So I was reading how many things were going wrong at that time. There was an interesting anecdote. I think it might have been your memoirs or Manmohan Singh's memoirs, where even the armored truck that was carrying the gold from the RBI to the airport in Bombay broke down, and then there was concern it might have been a heist.
It's a pity that Manmohan never wrote his memoirs. So it is in my memoirs. It's also, I think, in Rangarajan's account, because he was the deputy governor monitoring this. And in those days, you didn't have cell phones. So he was using one of these
walkie-talkies,
radio phones, and he was suddenly told that he was monitoring the movement of the truck from the Reserve Bank to the airfield where a plane was waiting. And he was told that the truck has broken down somewhere on Marine Drive. But don't worry, we're getting there was a flat tire or some such thing. So it's a very amusing story.
Yes, everything was going against it. It must have been a difficult decision, Montek, in that boardroom. It would have been yourself, perhaps Manmohan Singh. I'm not sure, maybe even the Prime Minister. It's a hard call for a country to ship its gold. What were the conversations, if you were a fly on the wall in that room?
Well, I wasn't party to those conversations, but, actually the decision to do it had been taken by the Chandrasekhar government, but the action was actually done by the second government, and Manmohan Singh, to his credit, sort of applauded the previous government for doing it. I mean, they said that, look, the crisis was really caused earlier, but given the crisis, it was important for India to build a reputation that India never defaults. And if necessary, we'll put our gold to back our credibility. And if the Bank of England is not willing to give money on the promise that the gold is here, then we ship the gold there. So he deflected what would otherwise be a silly nationalistic objection that the Bank of England doesn't trust you. I mean, all banks have their own regulations, and he said it was the right thing to do because it drove home to the people that, hey, time has run out. If the Reserve Bank is shipping gold, and visually the sense of being broke was really driven home. In an Indian family, when you sell your gold, that really means that you have hit a rock bottom.
Yeah, absolutely. So on that subject, Montek, do you think that if we hadn't had to ship the gold, liberalization would have happened or not happened? Do you think that that was that cathartic moment where the energy came to actually completely open the economy?
Well, that was only a very dramatic way of driving home the problem. I mean, had the Bank of England sort of bought the gold and given us the money and an assurance of repurchase, the gold wouldn't have been shipped. But it was quite clear that the Reserve Bank was restricting the permission to imports to an impossible degree. And I mean, I had exporters saying, look, what am I supposed to do? I've got an order to ship so many $1 million worth of something, and I need for that a fraction of that as imports, and the Reserve Bank isn't releasing money for me to import. How do you expect me to export? Clear breakdown of the system there.
Was there, it sounds like the political class and the technocrat class or the IAS class at that moment in time were working in cohesion and seeing things objectively, and there wasn't a friction between the two.
I think that's true. The dysfunctionality of the earlier system of controls had begun to be realized. I mean, I've mentioned in my memoirs that Rajiv Gandhi, who became prime minister towards the end of 1984 after the general election, he brought me into his office in January of 2005.
1985.
1985. And in his very first speech in Parliament, he said that, look, he'd been talking about getting India ready for the 21st century, which to us young fellows looked like the right kind of thing to do. And he made a very important point in Parliament, which was entirely spontaneous. He wasn't fed by any of us. He said, how can we be competitive if we are working with systems which are 20 years out of date? This is the very first time that any prime minister ever mentioned in Parliament there's something wrong with the system. I mean, many prime ministers had said we've got a crisis, there isn't enough food, exports have gone down, this kind of stuff. But nobody had ever said this is because the system's wrong. And I think that was, to me, a very important signal. And internally, we worked on it, trying to make changes. Some changes were made under Rajiv Gandhi, but I think in retrospect, they were limited and incremental. And I think he knew that. What later on led to a much stronger willingness to change was a result of a lot of thinking in government that what are the systemic changes that we need. And this actually, I mean, when Rajiv Gandhi was fighting the election, my boss, who was then his principal secretary, C.D. Deshmukh, wonderful person who had been cabinet secretary from Bombay. And it's interesting, he was the first cabinet secretary that we had from Bombay. And he was also, by virtue of being from Bombay, he was much more willing to think of positive interactions with the private sector. Previous cabinet secretaries were all in the mode of coming from UP and one or two maybe from the South, but they were not really comfortable with the private sector. C.D. Deshmukh was. So I think the sense that we must have a much bigger role for the private sector in the system was supported by him quite a bit. And I mean, he said to me that, look, we're making these changes, we're trying to make these changes, but we're not having much impact. So why is that? And I said the reason is that we're not making a systemic change. We keep looking at different ministries and seeing what can be done there. Actually, we need to do a kind of whole of government reform. What's wrong and what needs to be said. He said, well, why don't you start writing a paper? And if Rajiv comes back, we'll give it to him. Well, of course, he didn't come back. VP Singh came back. And then I mentioned this in my memoir backstage, that, I went with VP Singh when he was Prime Minister to a meeting, in an intergovernmental meeting, heads of government of Commonwealth in Malaysia. And at that meeting, VP Singh said to me, in one of these moments, these are moments when the officials get to meet their bosses, political bosses, in an informal kind of way. And he said, I used to come to Malaysia in 1973 as Deputy Minister for Commerce. And it was a pretty kind of sleepy, provincial type of town, and it is totally transformed. I said, yup, I used to come here in 1973 from the World Bank. And that was exactly my impression. So he said, how did they do it? I said, because they've done reforms, and we haven't. So he said, you write me a paper. And the thing that I was doing for Rajiv Gandhi, I then worked on and produced a paper for VP Singh. And the essence of that paper was that, look, the world's changing. Even the communist countries are changing. We have to similarly change. We're doing the wrong thing. And it wasn't in this ministry, this is wrong, and that. Some systemic changes have to be made. And one of those systemic changes is really all this industrial license control, import control, fixed exchange rate. That's just nonsense. Anyway, VP Singh then said, let's send this paper out to the cabinet secretary for a broader discussion. He didn't say I agree with it, but since it came from the prime minister, kind of people thought that maybe the prime minister is not opposed to these changes. It had no authorship. It was anonymous in that way. But it was interesting that the paper leaked. And when it leaked, it was picked up by the press. And I was surprised that quite a few people said positive things about it. Although the left was very, very critical, reflecting their own prejudices on this. So, at that point, that's when Ashok Desai, who later on I worked with when he joined the finance ministry, he said, well, we all know that it's written by Montec AHLUWALIA, but he's not admitting it. So let's just call it the M document. That's how it came to be called, the M document. Dr. Manmohan Singh had seen the M document because when he came back from Geneva working for Chandrasekhar, he had read it. And later on, he in his speeches had also said things of the same kind. So there was an understanding and an appreciation, certainly, I think, amongst the technocratic crowd and the few politicians who interact with them, that we do need to make changes.
So some interesting comments that you make, both on Rajiv Gandhi and VP Singh. In my generation, it felt that there was so much hope when Rajiv Gandhi became Prime Minister in 1984. There was so much promise for Vision 2020. And my generation feels completely let down by the fact that none of that happened. And you did use the word incremental. And I'll go back even one more generation. Today, it's quite fashionable to throw acid on Nehru and talk about how Nehru made a lot of mistakes. Yet a lot of what Nehruvian policy in the 50s and 60s was absolutely necessary. You did need the public sector. You did need government investment in education, steel, and it helped the economy in a large way until the 60s. The question is, did we stick on to Nehru's policies a lot longer than we should have? And were we still in those policies, as Rajiv Gandhi said 20 years later? Why was it so difficult when Rajiv Gandhi had the biggest mandate in Parliament to actually make sweeping changes and become the Malaysia that everybody saw?
No, it's a very good question. And actually, V. Sangvi and someone else did an interview with Rajiv Gandhi for Sunday, I think one of the magazines coming out of Calcutta. And they asked him this question, that you came with so much hope and you really weren't able to do that much. And Rajiv Gandhi was quite frank. He said, lack of experience. And he said, if I get another chance, I'll do better. A very frank statement by a politician who had just lost a general election. And you have to remember that, that's usually regarded as a wasted opportunity, because really, at the same time, Deng Xiaoping in China was doing fantastic things. But remember, Deng Xiaoping had been in Chinese Communist Party for 30 years. He was a dyed-in-the-wool politician. He had suffered under the Mao Zedong regime of re-educating politicians and, destruction of universities, etc. So when he got a chance, he really knew how to run the system. And he took some time weeding out the useless guys, bringing in the right guys. I don't think Rajiv ever did that. As a matter of fact, I'm not a political scientist, but if you look at it, he ended up losing all the people who actually were potential reformers and changers and got stuck with the old hang me down, so let me hand me down type of politicians that characterized his party. I mean, he lost VP Singh, he lost Arif Muhammad Khan, he lost a whole lot of other people who kind of left. And he was frank. He said, look, lack of experience. Politics is not an easy thing to run, especially if everybody around you is saying things are going wonderfully and you're the greatest. And that's what they were telling him all the time. He even had a cabinet meeting, I wasn't present, in Sariska, believing that, look, it would freshen the cabinet members' minds to look at options without being crowded in the usual Delhi office environment, than what we should do. But it never really came to anything. I think he didn't fully appreciate the need to design a reform program and then ask people, look, this is what I want to do. Here and there, when he would give a signal, they would instantly agree. But he never sat down and said, this is how we need to do things differently.
So coming back to Montek then, if Rajiv said if he didn't have experience, if he had a chance, he'd have done it differently in the second term, which never happened. Montek, if you had the chance to do it all over again, is there something you would have done differently from what you did in 91?
Now, that's obviously a tough question, because unless one is very foolish, one should always say that there must be things we got wrong. The real question is, would we have the intelligence? Would we have had the intelligence to know that then? Okay. I would say that in retrospect, probably the incompleteness of some of what we did should have been obvious. Let me give you just one example. We were very concerned that you need a much greater flexibility for Indian industry to compete. Okay, we were quite willing to subject the larger enterprises to competition from within the country, but the small-scale enterprises were very unwilling to get rid of the small-scale reservation. And we were running a system in which we had reserved for the small scale the very areas where India could be internationally competitive. I mean, garments and electronics and toys and this kind of stuff. I mean, by then the world had changed in the sense that if you wanted to sell garments, you would have large buyers saying, look, I love this, I want 1 million T-shirts or 500,000 T-shirts. And they would be meeting guys who are incapable of producing more than a few thousand T-shirts a week. Okay, we should definitely have got rid of small-scale reservation. And we could have done it different if the idea is not to allow big guys to move straight in. We could have done, for example, that anybody who has an established record in the small-scale sector is given a 5-year period to expand beyond the limits of small-scale if they can get some investment. That would have strengthened their ability. The Chinese never had this reservation nonsense. I mean, they started these small guys, and the ones that succeeded just expanded. We were not able to do this because of politics. And frankly, I think this was brought out. The need to get rid of reservation in those sectors where we are potentially competitive was brought out internally. But the political class just wasn't moved adequately. And I think in the case of the 91 reforms, you have to remember that, the government came in with a lot of goodwill that you're going to solve the problem. And to the great credit of Narasimha Rao and Manmohan Singh, by 1993, the crisis was over in the sense that, business was going on. We had switched to a dual exchange rate. It was working quite well. Exports were recovering and so on. Then you had the Babri Masjid. Now, the Babri Masjid weakened Narasimha Rao quite a bit within the Congress party. Not necessarily because the people concerned were acting on principle. They just thought that this weakened him. And so after 1993, his own ability to focus on economics weakened quite a bit. See, remember, I don't think he ever sold the reforms on the grounds that we're going to transit to a high growth rate. This was said, particularly by Manmohan Singh, but not by Narasimha Rao. The reforms were sold on the grounds that we're going to fix the crisis. The crisis was fixed by 1993. We were back to 5.5% growth or some such thing. What he needed to say to be able to carry political conviction is to say, look, 5.5% is not good enough. What I want to deliver for you is 7-8%. To do that, I need to do these extra things. And just as you trusted me to take care of the crisis and do all kinds of things which you never would have approved of, you should now trust me to do these other things so that I can get to this 7%, 8% growth that I need. That was never made a political slogan at all.
You've just explained something 30 years later where for my generation was always thinking, why did they stall? Why did it all slow down in 1993?
I think we have a similar situation today because there's a lot of enthusiasm, genuine enthusiasm amongst young people that India is now aiming to become what is called a developed country, which means a certain level of per capita GDP.
This is the Viksit Bharat.
And we also know Viksit Bharat. And we also know that for the next 20 years, that means India must grow at about 8% per annum. Current growth rate is around 6.5%. So we either have to face up to the fact that we are not serious about Viksit Bharat. Actually, even 8 is an average. Now, we're moving up from being the lower end of middle income and hopefully become the higher end of middle income and then trip over the middle income line by 2047. Now, it's well known that as you move up the chain, growth rates will slow down. So if you want an 8% growth between now and 2047, you should be targeting for the next 10 years, maybe 9% growth, and then allow for a slowing down to 7% and 6% towards the later years. Okay. So how is our present growth compared to what the target should be for the next 10 years if we are to achieve Viksit Bharat? There's a big gap. Now, whether the gap is 2 percentage points, 2.5 percentage points, that's a matter of detail. But the debate today should not be focused, in my view, on the fact that we are the fastest growing emerging market country, which we are. It is, are we growing the way we want to in order to achieve the objectives? And if we want to generate good quality employment for an increasingly well-educated, or at any rate better educated workforce, we need that growth. It's not going to happen if we don't get that. So you need a politics in which these things are constantly held out
on the front burner
as the tests of whether we are succeeding. I think we should also recognize that it's natural that we will not always succeed in everything. It's completely wrong to think that anybody can set a system where, like a rocket trajectory, you'll see the blip going exactly along the curve. There's a lot that's unknown, and the world is changing, happening right now. All kinds of new challenges are coming up. But some things need to be clear. Are we satisfied with the growth rate we've got? The answer should be no. So then the question is, what do we have to do? That defines the agenda. You won't get it right. You may make some mistakes. But unless we set the discussion on that basis, you'll again have disappointment 10, 20 years down the line.
Fair call. So just before we come to the present day, one last question on the experience with Montek. Post-91, 2004, your then boss finance minister Manmohan Singh became the prime minister. And I recall, perhaps again in your memoirs, you mentioned that he called you back from your job and said he's going to need a smart team around him. And then you were in the Planning Commission 2004 to 14. I want to take you to China at the same time. You did talk about Deng Xiaoping. Then Hong Kong happened in 1997. They had a new leadership by the early 2000s, and China was rocketing at that point. Having been to China many times, we even had 2 factories there which we had to close down. China works in a very different way from India, right? You have the furniture city, you have electronic city, you have TV city, cycle city, and they create an ecosystem in these regions that make the same product, and they compete almost in a Keynesian perfect competition because they're making such identical products. Yet for our competitors, we make technology and equipment for electric vehicles and batteries. For our competitors in China, they get land free from the government. They get their building free from the government. They get their testing equipment free from the government. Their R&D teams are off their balance sheet because they're young students who are coming out of university that the government pays for employing in these companies to create intellectual property. And then they get export incentives. You always hear in Indian boardrooms where people are saying, how do the Chinese sell at a price that I cannot even manufacture at? And it's because of all of these things, the whole ecosystem together, that allows them to do that. And they were clearly geared towards, I will be the biggest, I will make scale. It's almost economic colonialism because they come into the economy, destroy a particular sector because you cannot compete, and then you're reliant on China. Now, the incendiary part of my statement on that colonialism aside, what prevented India from having such clear policies to help Indian industry dominate? I know everybody says our political system is different, and it's fair, but let's talk about the brass tacks of that. What is the weakness in our system that doesn't allow us to do this?
It's a good question, actually. I mean, first of all, the exact nature of the support that the Chinese gave took some time to be realized. And certainly when our policies were being formulated, it was not understood. Yes, we knew there were hidden subsidies, but not exactly how much. And the second thing is that precisely the areas which they handled beautifully, like land being given free and so on, or in a very subsidized manner, were exceptionally difficult in India. Because the land market is the one market that we have just refused to modernize, okay? And we are in a very funny situation that we are not prepared to nationalize land. We're not prepared to say that land is a government resource which we will allocate. We regulate it intensely. We prevent, even if you buy land, you can't convert it for industrial use without going through a very complicated set of procedures. I think this is now being recognized and talked about, but I haven't yet seen a solution to it. So I think this is, we have to recognize that the one big difference between India and China, I mean, usually people talk of labor and people talk of land. There's no question that in labor, I mean, the Chinese were not burdened with the kind of labor restrictions, etc., that we have. Okay, I mean, you were allowed to come in from the rural areas if you wanted to work in industry, but you have very little rights or anything like that. And certainly in the case of land, we had nothing like it. So I think this is an agenda for today. I mean, if we are going to develop to what we're talking about, and we want a growth of manufacturing, that's going to mean a growth of urbanization. That's going to mean a certain amount of land shifting from current use, which is agriculture, to non-agriculture. The scale of that shift is massive. And I think I don't have a solution. I think it's now identified, but it's identified in a very vague kind of way as factor market distortion. I think somebody should, maybe Niti Aayog should write out a paper, prepare a paper on what do we need to do on land and are there alternative models. My view on this would be that we should do that, but we should also leave it free to the state governments to solve the problem. See, half the problem is, I mean, technically, land should be a state government problem. If a state government doesn't want to create an environment where industry is welcome, it should be free to do so. It is going to compete with other state governments, and if those state governments are willing to have a more flexible attitude, let the competition prevail. Okay?
We're doing the opposite, though. We're trying to walk away from the federal structure and have something far more centrally directed.
Well, I don't know on land whether that is the intention, but yes, that the debate today, there is a debate today that we've centralized. Now, certain things, it's true that we have centralized. I mean, for example, the GST. I mean, there were a whole bunch of state sales taxes. By making it all GST, we've, in that sense, centralized. I personally think that's a desirable thing. So that is a reform that is a good idea. It's a different matter that the structure of the GST isn't right. But certainly in land, I take a completely different view. I see no reason why We shouldn't simply say land is a state subject. There will be no central government restriction on it. Any state government that wants to announce a different land policy, if it can sell it politically to its people, it should be free to do so. Okay? That would perhaps give an incentive to state governments that investors will ask state governments that, look, this is what we're getting in Vietnam. This is what we're getting here. You want to relocate. The world is shifting. Nobody wants to be reliant now on Chinese-dominated supply chains. You want to be an alternative supply chain. Why don't you give us a sensible land policy? Then you will get some thinking going. And competition among the states is most likely to generate sensible results. Locking it into the lowest common denominator will be the worst. So there are states that will say that, no, you can't, if you are not a state, if you don't belong to a state, you can't buy land there. Some smaller states do that. Okay, let them do that. But larger states that have lots of land and one industry will perhaps not have the same prejudice. So we should do something like that.
So I want to bring you to the modern day then. We're in 2025 now. It's, 35 years since the liberalisation. And if anyone were to write a book about what the world would look like right now, it would almost seem like dystopia. 2025, the whole world has changed. We're in this bizarre situation where the leader of the free world is imposing tariffs, fighting with allies, and then the factory of the world, China, is weaponizing its supply chain. And in fact, in some ways, throttling countries like India who might become strategic competitors in the long term. In the meantime, a lot of our industry was decimated because we are so cost sensitive in India. And L1 always wins, whether it's private or public sector, and therefore China has always been the preferred supplier of anything from capital goods to t-shirts. And so, industries have disappeared in India, and we're trying to recreate this resilience, Atmanirbhar. In this context of 2025, I'm sure you wake up every morning over your cup of tea and you're contemplating how India should navigate this new, incredibly mercantilist world. What are your thoughts on, what should India be thinking of and doing to navigate this storm?
Let me reassure you. I have much more peaceful mornings than you make out. It's not my job to worry about these things, but I do occasionally reflect. You're absolutely right that the United States is turning topsy-turvy everything that most sensible people regarded as good economic policy. The trouble is that if we are right, what the United States is doing is going to be very damaging to the United States. So it's very difficult to deal with a negotiating partner if they're actually chopping off their own legs and feet and so on. Obviously, they don't believe that. There are people in the United States saying that what the president is doing will damage the United States. But, until that shows up in the results, I don't expect to see much change. It has to be admitted, it isn't showing up yet in the results. I mean, yes, the US growth rate has slowed down, but nowhere near as catastrophically as might have been thought, okay? Maybe the market doesn't believe that they're going to be quite as absurd as they say they will be. I mean, the whole theory of negotiating tariffs for the same product, which are different across countries, and then overlaying that with a geographical origin calculation to check whether they're being rerouted is a nightmare. I mean, it is the license permit Raj squared or cubed.
Ways, yes.
So whether they will do that or not, or how quickly they will change, I don't know. I also agree with you that China, by adopting weaponization, is seriously undermining its own credibility as an efficient supplier. From our point of view, by the way, the whole world should be concerned about that. And I think in this we have a common interest. Break China's monopoly in all these critical materials. At the moment, it has a monopoly, not of absolute supply in terms of the original material, but a monopoly because of the processing capacity. But these are things that over the next 4 or 5 years can change. And I think we should join in the effort. And we have a common interest with the rest of the world. And surely China must also realize that it doesn't make sense for them to follow a policy that will only get the whole rest of the world ganging up against them. But certainly while they're following it, we should join the rest of the world in doing that ganging up. And I agree with you that where we have been, if you like, suckered into an excessive dependence on China, we need to diversify our source of supply. That doesn't necessarily, by the way, mean Atmanirbharta, but it does mean that you can't rely only on China. So if there are other sources of supply that are just as efficient, nothing wrong with that. But if it turns out that if it's not China, we're probably just as good, and that may be so. I mean, for example, in things like active pharmaceutical ingredients, there's no reason why we can't be as effective. And usually the arguments given were that our policies towards whatever environment, etc., were not rational. Well, we better look at them and produce a ideally curated set of policies that would enable us to expand our API capacity. We should do that for sure. But, at the same time, I think we also need to think, what sort of a world do you think is going to emerge? Is it a world in which the whole world is going to behave like the United States? That everybody is going to be throwing up tariffs because they don't want anyone else coming in? Or is it that the rest of the world is concerned about weaponization by China and excessive dependence on China? I think it is. But this rest of the world may be more interested in trading amongst itself much more freely and much more openly. And that should be our approach. In other words, as we move away from China to other sources, the objective primarily must be diversification. Some of that diversification may best be met by producing it ourselves, and we should identify those things and do something about it. But for the rest, I think we should be integrating with a global economy, which at the moment the US doesn't want to integrate with. But I would hope that once the US sees the consequences of its tariff policies, it will also want to integrate with. That's why I'm very much in favor of what the government is currently doing. One, negotiating the FTA with the UK. I don't know where that stands, but we keep hearing that it's almost done. It's not yet done, but it's almost done. An FTA with the EU, which would be, to my mind, an extremely important signal. The view that India doesn't want to integrate with the world will be comprehensively rejected once we have an FTA with the EU. Because the FTA with the EU is not just something which enables us to compete only with the EU candidates. If we're to compete in the EU, since the EU also has an FTA with Mercosur, our products will have to compete with Mercosur products. So it's a kind of getting back into a rules-based trade, though unfortunately not a rule-based trade anchored in the WTO. Now that's a separate issue, whether we can revive the WTO to kind of come back in charge and police a global trading order is an issue. My own feeling is we need a global trading order. What the United States is doing can only be done by a very large hegemonic power that basically believes that it can do whatever it likes without any retribution. I mean, the damage of these policies is not the retaliation. The damage of these policies is what it will do to the U.S. itself. But at the moment, I mean, and the best, if you like, people to pronounce on that is the U.S. electorate, right? At the moment, the U.S. economy is not doing that badly. I mean, inflation is not shot up as some people thought it would. The growth rate has slowed down, but not nearly as much as many people said. But whether this will continue, because after all, many people in the market feel that some of these tariffs may never get applied, that they are a sort of a threat, and that within a few months it will settle down. We'll need to see. But we should be very clear that I don't think India would do well emulating the US by saying that, look, we just shut out everything and let it be grown at home.
And therein lies the dichotomy, because we need to build a fortress to protect ourselves from China because we do not have the same policies and the economies of scale, and yet we cannot survive with a fortress because we'll be going back to the license Raj. Our own experience in Europe, whilst the FTA will help, I agree with you, we find a reticence in Europe to an Indian supply. Indian technology, Indian product. Whilst that's not the case across every sector, it clearly is in energy and in new technology. And I put that reticence down to either a fear of creating another China. We're just going through China. Here's India. We're going to be reliant on India. Do it ourselves. There is, of course, the need to have European jobs in Europe and want to continue to manufacture in Europe. And there's a whole different argument about how countries like Germany and France are totally mismatched for the present world, just as the Japanese automotive sector. And the second part of that reticence is a general opinion that Indian quality is very poor, and that's not untrue, because a lot of the products that used to go there have been of very low quality. And Taiwan went down that road, Korea went down that road, China went down that road, but they had a very big PR strategy as their quality improved, and we haven't attacked that. So I'm not sure, without having access to the biggest market in the world, US, making an alliance with the mid-level economies, and including the European Union in that, will be adequate market for India to grow. That worries me a bit.
No. Let me be very clear about it. In terms of the size of the market, the EU is about as large. EU as a whole is about as large as the US is. Okay, but on the other hand, if we regard the EU as important, there's no question that we regard the US as very important, and especially in terms of the source of origin of new technology, whether you like it or not, that's going to come from the United States. Therefore, that's why our approach to the US is actually a little asymmetric, in the sense we are tolerating or accepting a lot of behavior which from a smaller country would be regarded as quite unreasonable. And I think that makes sense. The US is too important to ignore. Its trade policies currently are predicated on assumptions of what is good policy, which most people I know do not share. In other words, their view is that what Donald Trump is doing is not going to lead to the benefits that he thinks it will have for the United States. But I mean, he's the president and he's responding to his electorate, so it's best that we let them work that out. That's why I think most countries are accepting pretty unreasonable behavior from the United States, simply recognizing that this is what the French call the exorbitant privilege that being the hegemon gives you, and hope that it'll all settle down. Now, if it doesn't settle down, then we'll have to wait and see. But it would be completely wrong to think that India should be ignoring the United States. That would be a mistake. But the difference, I think, is when we deal with EFTA, with the EU, we're dealing in a free trade arrangement. We're not dealing in a series of reciprocal tariff calculations, unlike in the United States. And as you said, on many issues like IPRs and so on, there are unresolved issues which we need to open up on. And they will pose challenges to us. Signing an FTA with the EU will expose us to those issues and will force us to recognize that, look, these are the areas in which you have to reach an agreement if you want a greater integration of the two economies.
The second part of your the comment you made, which was, we have to come together, build the supply chain as a country, and create that resilience or self-reliance. Now, the rare earths are available in Ukraine, in Australia, in Kashmir. There clearly is the capability to do that. It will take 3 or 4 years, and that means 3 or 4 years of pain, 3 or 4 years of some sectors almost facing market failure for months when there's no supply chain available, prices are going up, there's a market distortion, there's arbitrage, all sorts of things playing in the market. And the two things going through my head here, Montek, is the Japanese did it in the 50s. They collectively went through the pain to get to the other side of the tunnel. The Koreans did it in the 70s. Is India capable of actually putting aside the rent-seeking mentality of just getting scale through the cheapest input costs, of collectively going through that pain for 3 or 4 years? And what does it take for sectoral reform? What does the government need to be thinking of? Because, which is the second part of my comment, we are not an innovation economy. We do not reward risk takers in innovation, not in policy, not in education policy, not in industrial policy, and clearly not in industry itself. We take someone else's idea and we're able to scale it up because it's a proven concept, because our entire economic structure does not reward people who come up with a crazy idea and invest in it and celebrate failure. So when you put those two things together, it's going to be very hard to get through this tunnel of creating self-reliance on rare earths. What do we need to be thinking about as a country to get government and industry together to get through this through with pain, with a lot of pain?
That's a very good question, a very perceptive question, and that's exactly the kind of thing I think we need to do more thinking about. Okay, I mean, in a way, the big thing in the 1991 reforms was stepping back from an industry by industry perception of problems to taking a more holistic view. Okay, that was for then a simpler world, a much easier. It was a no-brainer, quite honestly. This one is not a no-brainer because all of a sudden what's happened is you got a world in which, number one, the big countries are no longer willing to play by established rules. So there's an uncertainty. The United States wants to write its own rules. EU wants a general set of rules, but its rules, there is the example of China, which suggests that if you shut off everyone and do it yourself, you can succeed. I don't believe India should be following that example. I don't think anyone in India says that. So how do we handle that problem? But more than that, it's a period in which technology is changing very rapidly. I mean, the AI business, which everyone talks about. If nothing else were happening, AI would make a dramatic change in the structure of Indian industry. We haven't even started thinking about it. In fact, there's too much focus, in my view, on whether we are going to produce the next DeepSeek, and almost no focus on how much is Indian industry going to absorb AI, and when it does, what's going to be the impact on its structure. I mean, right now, for example, most of our IT giants are giving very clear signals that, look, we don't need that many more coders anymore. And those are very good jobs. They created the new young middle class educated guys they moved a whole bunch of people from very low levels of consumption to a very respectable level of consumption. And that is not going to expand. On the other hand, you have a young demographic where people with roughly similar skills are coming in, and they're going to be looking for similar jobs, and they're not going to be there. So how are we going to handle that problem? Big issue. And confounding all this is climate change, which is going to have an impact on traditional sectors. It's going to have agriculture, rising temperatures, what will it do to productivity, etc. It's going to have a major impact on water availability. Your supply is going to be seriously disrupted in the sense that total precipitation will not change, but its distribution will change massively, which means that there'll be a lot of runoff. So a lot of the water that falls won't actually be retained unless you do something on the retention of surplus water into the aquifers in the ground, which requires a lot of money, afforestation, things of that kind. And most of all, energy transition. I mean, one view is that the West caused the problem. We don't have to do anything about it. We should be allowed to burn coal for as long as we like. I just don't think that's the solution, for the simple reason that these older using technologies will no longer see technological improvement. Technological improvement is going to take place in the new technologies. So if you get stuck with the older technologies and keep investing in things that are going to be around for the next 50 years, you're going to see no technical progress in these areas because the rest of the world is giving them up. So we have to make these changes. Making those changes raises all these issues. I mean, yes, take solar cells, for example. Should there be any objection to buying Chinese solar cells? China has currently a capacity which is twice the world capacity. It's a perfectly understandable position from an Indian point of view that, look, if you're going to put up several thousand megawatts, gigawatts actually, of solar energy capacity, that's going to require a lot of solar cells, okay? That's a capacity for the Indian industry to respond to. How should that response be triggered? Should it be triggered by giving them some support and letting them compete with Chinese cells in terms of quality? Or should it be done by shutting off Chinese cells and letting these chaps sell Indian solar cells in a sheltered market? If you do the latter, there will be no incentive to keep up with modern levels of solar efficiency. I am told, I mean, I'm not knowledgeable on this, but I'm told that, solar efficiency and the rate of conversion of solar radiation into electricity, around 19-20% at the moment, is going up to 23%, could go further. So if new technology elsewhere is producing more expensive, more effective solar cells, and we lock ourselves into an old technology with absolutely no incentive to change because the chap setting up the solar cell will not actually have the opportunity to import, it'll be a disaster. Now, I can understand that when you talk about chips, which actually can end up controlling a system, you don't want if our relationship with China or any country, if it's not a trusted relationship, you don't want a chip from that country, so to speak, polluting your network by giving the ability to control it from outside. Understandable. So you make a list of sensitive things, the banking system, the railway infrastructure, the air traffic control, telecom system. Say, well, in these things, only trusted suppliers. An issue that arises, by the way, are trusted suppliers only Indian suppliers? Or just not Chinese suppliers? Is a European supplier trusted? Is a French supplier trusted? Is an American supplier? I think if you don't address these questions head on, you can get some very absurd decision. The biggest mistake in this would be to say the only trusted source is an Atmanirbhar source. Because after all, look, when it comes to defense equipment, we are not relying, we're not 100% Atmanirbhar anyway, right? So there must be a concept of what is a trusted source. There must be a concept of broadening the trusted source. And let's face it, we are not the only persons addressing this issue. I mean, if Americans have been relying on chips from whatever, China and elsewhere, they must also be asking the question, what's the trusted source? So we should hope that everybody else expands the set of trusted sources so that we too can pitch in on that. But when it comes to a solar cell, I mean, is it any different from a cooking pot? It doesn't give you the right to control the rest of the panel. So there's a straight economic decision. And I think it's an issue here that, if the rest of the world is buying solar cells at a certain price, and you, in pursuit of your own Atmanirbharta, jack up the price to twice that level or something like that, you must accept that the solar electricity you produce will be that much more expensive.
Well, it's back to 91 all over again because you create.
Well, I'm hoping it won't be, but it won't be only if enough people articulate this point. And to be honest, this is where you ask me, what does it take? Well, first of all, I think it takes, for the government, I think it requires a willingness to recognize that the problem is complex and there are multiple solutions, and they must set up systems where they're made aware of these multiple options so they're not driven down a particular path. I'm sure that organizations like Niti Aayog and so on, they're quite capable of spelling out these alternatives. Now, in order to spell out these alternatives, Indian industry needs to be much more vocal. I can understand that someone producing a solar cell would be quite, harking back to the 1991. But somebody actually using a solar cell should be making the contrary point. And I don't find enough of that debate in industry at the moment. Maybe industry is not the place to do it. Well, maybe the various think tanks are the place to do it. And those think tanks can interact with the government's think tank, which is Niti Aayog. But to my mind, we need much more of that. We are in serious danger otherwise of sticking with the energy transition as a slogan. It's a wonderful slogan, but deriving the wrong policies from that slogan because we haven't adequately analyzed what the options are.
My big worry with the energy transition, we're across all three sectors. We're across the EV, battery, and hydrogen. And in all three, the technology clearly is from China, and China is clearly the technology leader. When it comes to EVs, they're beating the pants of the Japanese and the Germans. When it comes to batteries, nobody's close. Not even the Japanese. Hydrogen, everybody is buying their cells. The stack for the electrolyzer from China, including the Europeans. They've been at this from 2004, 2005. They've been quietly working at this, and it went into a major trajectory in 2014, 2015. So the energy transition is most impacted by the fact that China leads and China controls all of the access to material and technology to be efficient. And so, if we want to really be Atmanirbhar of our energy crisis, and therefore not importing fuel from Oman and Qatar and Saudi Arabia and wanting to make our own hydrogen, then there's a trade-off there, which is it has its implications on geopolitics, on foreign policy, not just on trade policy, and it'll be very interesting to watch because I suspect nobody, not in industry or government, really knows where this is going to end up, because we are in truly uncharted waters, like perhaps we were 100 years ago when the Industrial Revolution was happening, or 150 years ago when the Industrial Revolution was happening. Montek, I want to take you to 2 points of reflection. If you were to meet a 28-year-old Montek as you were walking down the street, what advice would you give this young Montek in terms of the shifts in demographics, climate change, and technology that are happening? And what advice would you give this younger Montek on what to think about and what to do to be successful in his career?
That's a huge responsibility. But when I look back on when I was 28, I really never felt the need to get advice. One of the good things about people who are 28 is that they feel by then they've either had a good enough education to know that there are multiple sources and you need to be sure of what these sources are. But the most important advice I would give is that, look, technology is going to change much faster for your generation than it did for us. And certainly when I go back to when I was 28, look at the amount of time it took for many of the things that we today take for granted becoming mainstream. Today, whatever, ChatGPT went mainstream in 2 years or some such thing. So rule number 1 is technology is going to change. I think rule number 2 is that, it's extremely important for people to recognize that education can no longer be viewed as something you do for a certain period of your life. Then you get a certification, then you get a job, and then you get promoted and so on and are successful. A lot more investment in keeping up with technology. That need not mean going back to universities, but it does mean choosing jobs and assignments where you will learn. And frankly, for firms also, it requires a much, much greater thinking about how to keep re-educating your workforce. Take somebody who's had hundreds of guys doing coding. Today they don't need that many coders. A lot of the stuff is done by AI, but the few people that remain have to be supervising what AI does. But for that, the coders have to be adequately trained on AI to be able to do that job. I have no idea, quite frankly, whether enough of our companies are thinking about that. I'm sure this is a relatively new phenomenon, so it's something that we need to think about the next 5 or 6 years. The last thing I'm very fond of telling young people, and I sort of find they kind of like it, that one of the consequences of technology changing much more rapidly than in the past is that the relative importance of age is going to go down. In the old days, if you had a guy who had 20 years experience in something, he would tend to ride roughshod over someone who had 2 years experience. And that made a lot of sense if it was the same technology, because you had 20 years more experience with the technology. But if the technology has changed in the last 2 years, the guy with 2 years of experience in your company may well be giving you better insights than the guy with 20. So for them, the change in the relative importance of seniority to mastery over new technology is going to make a big difference in their lives. I also think that most of them will do many more jobs than their parents did. I mean, look, when I graduated, the hope of one's parents was that you get into a good job and you stay there with an assured income and all the rest of it. Most of us thought that was a bit too boring and, surely one will change jobs once or twice. But these kids are going to change jobs much more often than that. And frankly, I think anybody who prepares themselves for change without actually knowing what that means will be best able to handle the kind of world that lies ahead. What is worrying, by the way, is that the one area that is absolutely structured not to do that is the government. In the government, seniority trumps anything else. Structures are inflexible. New ideas are difficult to feed in. And I sympathize with our political leaders because I don't think they're adequately aware that they're not actually getting all the feedback they need. So I think they need to consciously create systems of critical feedback, not just feedback, but critical feedback. And within the top levels, there needs to be an understanding and an appreciation that some of these systems are necessary in order to get policy fixed in the right direction. Now, I don't know how other governments are handling it, because this is not just an Indian problem. It must be a problem all over.
That is an interesting question. It would be interesting to do a paper on how governments are handling it.
Yeah,
I'm
absolutely.
sure one of the big five is working on it. Montek, what gives you the most hope in the present environment?
Oh, I'm a great believer in either your mentality is organized to hope for the best or not, and I'm an optimistic kind of guy. And I look back, this is after all a country with a long tradition, and it's gone a long way, and it's changed in many, many ways. The problem is that all these changes are generating new tensions. So it's very easy to get snowed down by that. But, I'll give you one good example of hope is look at the India cricket test match in Edgbaston. And I sort of looked at the top people who performed well and looked at their backgrounds. These are not people from any elite context. Some of them are from surprisingly ordinary environments, and yet they've not only been able to improve, but they've worked themselves into a system that has been able to select them. So we must be doing something right somewhere, to be doing these things.
Final question then, Montek. What's with the color blue? You always had the blue turban. In fact, your boss Manmohan Singh also was most often on a blue turban. Is it a lucky color?
It's good. Actually, the fact that he preferred blue is probably more. He has to give the answer to that. But the reason I choose blue is simply that when I did a lot of traveling, you always had to sort of dress in a suit in those days. These days I don't know whether I haven't seen pictures of all these important meetings, the G20. I still haven't seen people turning up in T-shirts and so on. It will happen in due course. But you had to wear a suit, and almost invariably that used to be a blue suit. And if it had to be a blue suit, you invariably ended up with a blue tie. And if you're going to have a blue tie, then, it's a bit difficult to have different from a blue turban. So I just sort of zeroed in on blue. But mind you, I use a green turban when I play golf.
Okay.
I haven't done that much of it recently, but so I'm not a dedicated blue turban guy.
Excellent. Montec Singh AHLUWALIA, a large part of young India today has you to thank for the fact that they can do interesting jobs following their passions. When we were growing up, the only jobs you could do were to be a doctor, engineer, join the IAS, or run away from the country. Post-liberalisation, you could follow your passions and be a baker, or be a DJ, or be a pet specialist, and do all sorts of interesting things. And a large part of India has you to thank for that, for having had the courage to do what was necessary. Thank you for coming on the show today, for your candidness. It's been an incredibly enjoyable conversation, and I hope we get to have more of these again in the future.
Thanks very much. I enjoyed it. And by the way, I think it's not that you got me to thank, but a certain generation of people who worked together I think this is a very important point. I mean, I was privileged to have an inside track for a very long time. But, you know, the idea that one person did it, it wasn't even just Manmohan Singh alone. Somehow, the ability to collect like-minded people, to listen to them and to consult and then take the right decisions with a sense of participation so that everybody felt involved. This, I think, was a remarkable thing in 1991, and I think whoever is running the country should view that as an important thing to try and achieve.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Montek.
Thank you.